both of them. On the far side from me, Steve Gilly. And Steve, you may recognize his voice. He worked at WTFM in Kingsport. And let's see, there was an A in there too you worked at.
I've worked at a whole bunch. TFM, KPT,
Yeah,
KIM,
you did all over.
yeah.
So you probably heard him in one time on the radio. And Rod worked in radio too. So this is Rod Mullins. Rod is a high school teacher. But
What, poor thing?
it's called the fourth thing there. But he has a love of radio too. He worked in radio for a while. But the two of them get together once a week and they put together what's called a podcast. Now, who in here knows what a podcast is? Hey, looky there, fellas. We're more aware of it than you know. Have you ever heard of the Stories of Appalachia podcast?
Yes.
Okay, well, these are the gentlemen who do that. And they're going to tell you tonight about Sam Brinkley. And I think the video side you're going to put up on YouTube about this, right?
No, we're going to be doing a video about this.
Yeah, so there you go. So we'll let them tell their stories, and we'll have a little question and answer at the end. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Steve and Rod, and learn about Mr. Sam Brinkley.
How y'all doing?
Andy.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great introduction, David. We appreciate that. Yeah, Rod and I do have a podcast. We also do the podcast on YouTube if you'd rather watch us. And we also have an Instagram and TikTok accounts where we do short videos talking about Appalachian history. But we're here today basically over, well, two men. One, Sam Brinkley. Now, here's a question. Keep this in mind and see if you can figure this out. We'll give you the answer at the end. What does Sam Brinkley, the Carter family, $1 million or $1 million watt Mexican radio station, and Billy Goats have in common? Not somebody already knows.
We got to throw in Jimmy. We got to throw in
Don't spoil the surprise.
Jimmy Rogers in Del Rio, Texas, also.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Anyway, we're going to start with Sam. Does anybody here, by the way, has anybody ever heard the word pogonotrophy? Were you going to learn it? Pogonotrophy.
Gosh, I'm an English teacher and I don't even know that word, Steve.
That is the science of growing a beard. And Sam Brinkley was an expert scientist when it came to that. Now, he was, as many of you know, he was born in 1850 in Yancey County, September 21st. But his family moved to Snow Creek in Mitchell County when he was a young man. When he got a little bit older, he met a lady named Vista Street, married her, and moved to Magnetic City, now Buladean, right here, and had himself a farm, and he also worked and taught school for a living. Now, he was one of those guys that didn't have a whole lot of facial hair, when he was young. You've seen those guys you went to high school with. They didn't start to sprout whiskers until they were grown. That was him. But when he started, it didn't stop. In fact, they say that he had to shave 2 or 3 times a day at one point, until he got to the point where he just didn't want to fool with it, right? He decided not to shave after that. Now, Vista wasn't too crazy about that. She would rather have him be clean shaven. But he said, I'm just going to go ahead and stop shaving, and he did. Now, just because he stopped shaving didn't mean that he turned into a big old beardy fella. He was very fastidious, from what I hear, about his appearance. Wanted to make sure he looked really good, so he would shampoo his beard and comb it out every day and take real good care of it. And that's fine until the beard just kept growing and growing and growing until it got down to his feet. At that point, he had to do something about it. And what Vista did was she knitted him up a silk purse or a pouch about the size of a half-pound flour sack, and he would roll that beard up, put it down in that pouch, put the pouch around his neck, and tuck it into his shirt. That way he could go about his business, going out and working the farm and teaching the kids and doing what he needed to do. Eventually, he would take that pouch and the beard and go on into his classroom, and The longest that this beard got was about 5'4" from what I've read. I think some said 5'6", some said 5'7". I've seen some newspaper accounts that say 6 foot, but he was only 5'10", so I don't think that would have been the case in that case. When he was at school, and Rod, I guess you could kind of go along with this, kids get kind of curious about stuff, don't they?
Much too curious, especially in middle school, but they didn't have really middle school at that time, but still, they're a very curious lot.
And wouldn't you think they'd be curious about that beard?
Yes, they would be.
And they certainly were. They would beg him to take that beard out of that pouch and show it to them. And he'd do that, because he loved those kids, for 10 cents. Quarter for groups, though. So if you had a group of folks, you could get a discount that way. But he would take that out and show that. He also did postcards and eventually sold a bunch of those. And then he kind of got the idea that maybe there was something about this whole beard thing. So he started to look around to see how he could maybe profit a little bit from this magnificent beard, as I call it. One of the things that he did was place an ad, at least one ad, maybe several more, in the New York Sun, asking if anybody up there had a position for him, such as in a circus or a museum or what have you. You know what? That worked, because the Barnum and Bailey Circus found that and hired him, put him in the sideshow as the man with the longest beard in the world. Well, I have to tell you, he didn't have the longest beard in the world. That was some fella, I think over in Norway, had a 14-foot beard that, from what I hear, he tied around his waist, so he wouldn't trip on it. Anyway, he went to work with Barnum and Bailey Circus, and also did work with the John Robinson Circus and the Ringling Brothers Circus as well, and with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. He became buddies with Buffalo Bill. And I think probably he loved that job more than any of the other ones. But he would go out on tour, and they would show him off on the sideshow with his beard, and along with all the other sideshow characters that were there. And he just went all over the country. I think, David, did you not say 46 states that you had heard? 46 states, Canada, and probably over in Europe. He did, on a tour to Canada, by the way, meet the King of England, Edward VIII, or Edward VII. And Edward VII had a fine beard too, not anywhere near as long as this, but he was proud of his beard, and he was fascinated by Sam's beard. And Sam was fascinated by the King's beard. So they swapped photographs, autographed photographs with each other. So just think about Prince William going through old family books and finding a picture of a guy that grew up here and great-great-grandpa's stuff. Well, he worked at the circus circuit with the circus and with the Wild West show for about 20 years. In between the times he's out on the road, when the circus shuts down for the year, he would come back here and work his farm and teach the kids, and then go back out on the road. And he did this every year. The kids loved him. I think he worked in 21 schools, 21 different schools for a career. He also got into the curiosity museums, if you've ever heard of those. That's how the P.T. Barnum Circus started. He had a curiosity museum in New York that actually burnt to the ground, and that's what caused him to come up with the idea of getting a train and taking his curiosity museum on the road as a circus. But Sam would go to places like Chicago and New York and appear in those museums, and then come home on the train, stopping at places like Knoxville and Asheville. And you'd see newspaper stories about him. Oh, the famous Sam Brinkley has showed up here at the train station. He's on his way home from Chicago in his last appearance. And they was all excited about that. It's said that he had family over in Johnson City, and it's said that he went over there to visit quite often. This is a story that was told by his nephew. There were not enough beds over there for everybody, So Sam would go visit, and he'd have to bunk with one of the kids, generally this nephew. And the nephew said that one night he had a strange dream that he was caught up in the hay when the hay cutting machine came along and was baling up the hay. He woke up, he said, to find that he was all tangled up in Uncle Sam's beard because it all came out of the pouch, and got himself out of that. But that's one story about him. He was also offered, I guess what they call now a deal to do some promotion. In other words, there was a wonder tonic out there that was supposed to grow hair. And they came to him and they said, Sam, my man, we have a deal for you. You can make a ton of money if we just let you come up here and promote our wonder tonic to all these people that want their beards to look like yours. He wasn't going to do that. Sam was an honest man. He was a Christian. I don't think he smoked or drank or anything, but his response to this company was, quote, the good Lord grew this hair on my face and I ain't lying about it. Now, Sam eventually came off the road after making thousands of dollars on the sideshow, settled down to his farm. He still did those curiosity museums and appeared at carnivals around the South. But other than that, he just stayed here in Mitchell County. In, I think, February of 1928, was it, Rod? Mm-hmm. His wife passed away. Yeah. And then in December of 1929, he came down with, of all things, tonsillitis and was taken to the hospital in Johnson City, where he succumbed to the disease, and he died December 13th, 1929. He's buried just up the road at the Presbyterian Church. Now, we mentioned that story, or that question about Carter family, a 1,000,000-watt Mexican radio station at Billy Goat's, and I think you said that you knew the answer. So what's the answer? You get the prize, which is nothing, but you still get the prize. Rod's going to tell you about John Brinkley.
I was going to fly out too, Steve, talking about Sam Brinkley. There were a number of people from the Appalachian region who were taken into the sideshows and the circuses over a period of time. And that's the Siamese twins. I'm trying to think of their name. Up above Mount Airy.
Channing Bunker.
And then we also had another one that very close to home, at least where my wife and I live. We live just across the state line from eastern Kentucky. I don't know if any of you have heard of him, Martin Van Buren Bates. He was one of the, well, at least the biggest men, at least at that time in the world. Yeah. Mm-hmm. He married a woman who was also as tall, or maybe even just a little bit taller than him.
I think an inch taller than him.
A little bit taller than him. They traveled Europe, went all over the place, and even met Queen Victoria. Yeah. And she gave them, I think it was watches. I believe it's what she gave them, something like a watch.
I think they were matching gold watches.
Matching gold watches was what it was, is what she gave them. And that was kind of their wedding present, because the Queen put on the wedding. Yep. Is essentially what she did. It was just really, really wild to just hear all this stuff. And then he is buried now, he and his wife, or they tried to have children, they were unsuccessful, things just didn't work out. But they're buried in Ohio, and they have a farm place up in Ohio. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it's a pretty big spread up there, what they have. That's where they went to settle after they retired, went up there and lived and so forth. And so there's a lot of people from Appalachian region and stuff that had been pulled away to go to the circus and everything, except for this man that I'm getting ready to talk about. This man may have belonged in the circus, but obviously not doing something very nice. But yeah, we've talked about things with Sam Brinkley, and we're going to tell you the story about, or I am at least, talk a little bit about it with Dr. John Brinkley, born in Burnsville, North Carolina, and he was also a cousin of Sam Brinkley. And he has a very interesting story, to say the least. And it's one very, very long story full of twists and turns. And, at times when I read this, I want to start cackling out loud and just laughing hysterically. And then I'm thinking, this is terrible at the same time of what really happened. But let's go on. John Romulus Brinkley was born in 1885 to John Richard Brinkley. Now, the elder Brinkley had served as a medic for the Confederacy during the Civil War. And, he continued to practice medicine in the Burnsville area after the war had ended. John Richard Brinkley was also quite the ladies' man, much like my great-great-grandfather, who married as many as 5 times, I think. John Richard Brinkley married 5 times, outliving every one of his wives. Okay? One of those wives was Sarah T. Mingus, who had a 24-year-old niece, Sarah Candace Burnett, who lived with the couple and worked as a housekeeper for them. So in 1885, Sarah Burnett gave birth to John Romulus Brinkley. Unique name, solidifying John Richard Brinkley's reputation as, you guessed it, a ladies' man. Despite this, Sarah Brinkley remained with her husband and raised the child after her niece's death of pneumonia and TB when he was 5 years old. John's father died when he was 10 years old, and Aunt Sally, as he called her, called the father's wife, sent him to school in a one-room log cabin in the Tuckasegee, I hope I've got that right, Tuckasegee River area, and it was there that he developed his drive to be a doctor just like his father. But now, he didn't take a normal route to being a doctor, not like what we would see today. He had to stop along the way and have some, what would we say about this, Steve? Odd jobs along the way, so to speak.
You could put it that way, yeah.
Sort of like radio and then going back to law school?
Exactly like that.
Okay. So, at 16, John finished school up, and he took a job delivering mail. He also learned how to use the telegraph and went to New York City to work for Western Union, and during that time he took the experience that he received and moved to New Jersey to work for several railways as a telegrapher. Now, on Christmas Day, 1906, his Aunt Sally passed away. John went home to North Carolina to be with her in her final days, and it was there that he reignited a relationship, so to speak, with a girl that he had met at that one-room log cabin, and her name was Sally White. Now, not only did that relationship reignite, so to speak, it took off like a rocket, and the couple was married a month later on January 27th, 1907 in Sylva, North Carolina. So after that, they soon got hitched, of course. They left town, and then they started doing something that was a little bit out of the ordinary. They started posing, of all things, as Quaker doctors. How many of you know what a Quaker is? You've heard of Quaker. I know, Quaker Oats, that's the first thing I think of. The poor little guy on the little hat and so forth. But, very peaceful, very kind of nice people. Well, that's what they started posing as initially. They traveled through the Appalachian Mountains and they hawked patented, or so they said, medicines, but they were really patient medicines, and they made a tidy little profit during this whole time. But then, as John Brinkley moved to, of all places, Knoxville, Tennessee, where he hooked up with a man who called himself Dr. Burke. And Dr. Burke, along with John, they went and started pushing several different tonics designed to help kickstart a man's virility. This was a sign of things to come. I think a lot of you already have the direction where we're going with this here. Well, later that year, he moved to Chicago, he and his wife, leaving a certain notoriety that had formed over John and Dr. Burke. Then the couple had a daughter, Wanda Marion Brinkley. And then John enrolled at Bennett Medical College to get his medical degree so he could become a real doctor. Now, of course, Bennett was not your standard medical school. Now, I take it that Bennett was sort of like your, what would you say, correspondence school, so to speak?
Maybe it was that good. We don't know.
Okay, that's what I'm guessing. Maybe sort of like a correspondence school. May have been the predecessor for distance learning. I don't know how you want to call that. But still, it had questionable curriculum, and it focused on something called eclectic medicine, okay, whatever that is. Now, in order to pay the bills and the tuition, John took work as a telegrapher with Western Union at night when he went to college during the day, so he did go to college. And despite this, the debt started to mount up because John and Sally liked to spend money. especially Sally. And the costs of raising a baby girl weren't anything to sneeze at either, but John soldiered on. So at school, he started learning about something that he felt like was very important: the glands of the body and their effects on the functions of the body. And he figured that this was the field that would help move his career along. And he was right too, as this was a sign of things to come. Boy, were they a sign of things to come, I'll tell you that. For 2 years, John Brinkley kept at it. And he was working for Western Union at night and then studying during the daytime. And debt forced him to take that second shift at Western Union, and soon all he was doing was working, studying, and then getting deeper into debt. Sally was lonely. She filed for divorce. She asked for child support, which was granted. 2 months of paying child support, though, was more than John was willing to do, so he kidnapped Wanda, took off to Canada with her, and there he stayed until Sally, unable to afford a lawyer to file extradition papers, dismissed his divorce suit and that child support order, allowing John to immediately return to Chicago with their daughter and resume their marriage. So he kind of had her over a barrel, per se, about the whole thing. So by all this time, John had finished up at Bennett Medical College, and then Sally left again, going back home to North Carolina, where she gave birth to another daughter, Erna Maxine Brinkley. Now, John gave up and moved back to North Carolina too, and resumed living with Sally and the girls. There he began to work at what was, well, he called an undergraduate physician, is what he was working as. But he failed to get a practice established. This led him to move with his family from place to place between North Carolina and Florida, trying to get something started, and all of this to no avail. But man, he was all over the place there at one time, just looking for jobs and everything else that he could. What do you have to add about that?
I think you're doing fine.
Okay, I'm just asking.
I mean,
here.
this guy's, he's done everything, and he's going to continue to do everything from what you're saying here.
Okay. Well, by this time, they had gone, and, he'd already done this, and he realized that he wasn't going to make it if he stayed home in North Carolina. I think I heard that comment here just early on and stuff. If you go and you came here, you wanted to leave, or you had to in order to get a good job or something to leave, very much like my situation back home in Dickinson County and Weiss County, Virginia, because it was all dependent on coal. And if coal wasn't doing good, you left out of town and you went to find something else. Well, he ended up moving to St. Louis to attend medical school and finish his education. He applied at school after school after school. But then he was unable to get his foot in the door because Bennett Medical School refused to release his transcript since he owed them money. Okay. So unable to finish his education, you think that John Brinkley would give up on his dream of being a doctor, right? Wrong. He bought a certificate from a diploma mill, the Kansas City Eclectic Medical University. And I thought this was kind of weird, hearing this at first. And then we had a situation, I think, that developed in Bristol, Tennessee, not too long ago, with the superintendent up there. And the superintendent had a doctorate degree. Well, nobody really questioned about him having a doctorate degree till they found out it was a doctorate degree in coins, knowing about coins or something, and they had hired him and so forth. So here it is. He gets a diploma from a diploma mill. This
And this was eclectic medicine.
Yeah, eclectic medicine.
We still don't know what eclectic medicine is, right?
Well, it's something, I guess, eclectic means it's, just a wide variety of, little things all thrown together, I guess, is what it all comes down to. So this eclectic medicine, who knows what it meant? The Kansas City Eclectic Medical University did issue him that diploma, so to speak, and he went back home to North Carolina, where his third daughter was soon born. Now, he then took his family to New York to work as a telegrapher for Western Union, but he wasn't going to give up on being a doctor, and he told Sally as much. But that's when Sally actually gave up on him, pretty much. She gave up on John Romulus Brinkley. She left him for the final time, took the girls back to North Carolina, and then Brinkley found another medical opportunity. He got back in, I'm just going to say this, cahoots with the infamous Dr. Burke of Knoxville fame. And they had an idea for a business in all places, Greenville, South Carolina. Burke, whose real name was James E. Crawford, along with Brinkley, opened up the Greenville Electromedic Doctor's Practice. I have no idea, electromedic.
It sounds modern. That's what it is.
It's just electromedic. Ugh. Well, anyway, Crawford along with Brinkley, they opened that up, and then they set about running ads in to bring men into their establishment who had concerns about their, what's the word I'm thinking of, Steve?
Sex drive, okay?
Their vigor. Let's make it clean. This is a family audience here. Let's try to make it clean, okay? So what they would do is they would inject these men with colored water at $25 a shot, okay? Telling them that they were getting the newest thing from Europe, something that they called electric medicine. All of this was good for 2 months, and after those 2 months, the pair then left town. They left behind unpaid rent, utility bills, and debts from medical and pharmaceutical supplies, and they even owed for the clothes on their back, of all things. So they hightailed it to, of all places, Memphis, Tennessee. There they got in Memphis, he found love again, John did. And it was the daughter of a local doctor, Minerva, known as Minnie, or Minnie Jones. Now, the two had a long courtship with each other, 4 days. And they were married at the famous Peabody Hotel on August 23rd, 1913.
That, I believe, is the one with the ducks that come in,
Yeah,
right?
I've been in the one in Orlando. I've not been at the one in Memphis, but they have the same thing. They have the ducks that come down and greet you and so forth. Okay, well, that too will come back to haunt John Brinkley, but not in the too distant future. So then the couple took off to a couple of different places. They went on an extended honeymoon. They went to Kansas City, Denver, Pocatello, Idaho. What's in Pocatello, Idaho? Potatoes?
Yeah, probably.
I'm just like, Pocatello, Idaho, and then back to Knoxville. Okay. Well, that last destination was not a good choice because Brinkley was then recognized and arrested and then extradited to Greenville, South Carolina. And he faced criminal charges of practicing medicine without a license and for writing bad checks. While he was a guest in the Greenville jail, he decided that it would be in his best interest to tell the sheriff that it was all Dr. Burke's doing. So he gave the investigators information on where they could find Dr. Crawford, and of all places, Pocatello.
Well,
that's where
how
they
about
went
that?
to. Okay. Crawford was arrested and then sent back to Greenville, where he sat in a cell near his former partner as they awaited trial. But that trial never came to fruition. The two settled out of court, and those merchants, they had cheated in Greenville for several $1,000s, most of which Crawford paid. The rest paid by Minnie Brinkley's physician father, and John went back to Memphis to be with her. Now, again, more licenses, more studies, different things like that, of going to different things. And then he tried to make a go of it in the Army Reserve Medical Corps. That's what John Brinkley did, but the dream lived on. And then he found out about a doctor decided to leave Arkansas to move to another state. So guess what? He offered Brinkley to take over his practice, and John accepted. And so he started, finally getting some traction, at least believability as a doctor, and finally started being able to pay off the Bennett Medical School for what he owed in tuition. But in return, Bennett released his medical records, and then he was able to get into the Kansas City Eclectic Medical University and finish his formal education. So he continued his study of the glands as it went on for such a long time, and then finally graduated on May 7th, 1915. And he started into a private practice with Swift and Company meat processing plant in Kansas City. Now that just amazes me here, where he tended the men's wounds, and he also studied animal physiology. Okay. I don't think I'm going to view a ham by Swift in the same way ever again. As Dr. Brinkley studied the animals at Swift and Company, he found that most of the men in the plant felt that the healthiest animal slaughtered there was, of all things, a goat. Now, that was based on their story there, is what they told him. So, we'll get back to that in just a minute. We've got some bigamy to take care of now, okay? We're talking about bigamy here. Now that John was an honest-to-goodness doctor, many decided that he needed to take care of that being married to two women problem that he already had. And so word got out, and he went to jail. So he filed for divorce from Sally in 1915, saying he didn't know where she lived. So with that little lie, he was granted a divorce on February 21st, 1916. And 4 days later, Minnie and John were married again in Liberty, Missouri. And then from that time, he was pulled from his job at Swift to serve in World War I as a medic. And unlike his father, the senior John Brinkley, who we said served as a medic for the Confederate Army, Dr. John was not cut out for what he saw in war. He served only a little over 2 months, almost all of which he had from suffering a nervous breakdown. He was discharged and sent home, and in October, he and Minnie moved to Milford, Kansas, after seeing an ad in a newspaper stating that the town was looking for the doctor. And guess what? Let the fun begin, because now we're getting started on the way that everything is going to start kind of transpiring. One day this patient comes into the clinic and says to Dr. Brinkley, ask him if he had a way to fix someone who was considered to be, quote unquote, sexually weak. As a joke, Brinkley responded that all he needed was a pair of those butt glands in you, end quote. That was his actual quote. Okay? Sounds like another sawbones doctor back from the town that I come from. So just would tell you plain and simple what you needed and not mince words about it. Well, this patient must have been very desperate, for he didn't take the doctor's response as a joke. What he did was, he took it serious. And then he begged the doctor to operate on him and to put those glands in him. Okay? Finally, Dr. Brinkley agreed to do the operation for, get this, $150. Payment was made, and soon this man was walking around with a pair of goat testicles, gonads.
That's where the billy goat comes from.
That's right, where the billy goat comes from. And, from that point on, that's what ended up happening to him. Okay, as we go on here, the operation caught on, and then Dr. Brinkley began performing it more and more, then increasing his fee, like with everything else in free enterprise, from $150 to $750. There must have been some valuable gonads, Steve. That's all I can say about it.
A lot of men that needed some help, yeah.
Yeah, they must have needed some help. So after one operation, the wife of a patient ended up getting pregnant. Word got around to several newspapers, which sent reporters to interview the doctor about the operation. Now, you got to remember, Dr. Brinkley was a savvy marketer. I don't know if you could say him and Sam were savvy marketers to a certain degree.
Well, they were, but in two different ways.
In two different worlds, if we call it that. But he hired an advertising agent to market his treatments as turning men, I'm sorry, get ready for this, turning men into the ram that I am with every lamb.
His words, by the way.
That's his words, by the way. I can tell looking at some of you are looking and saying, are you serious about this? And we are. We're very serious, because when I first read this script and we started talking about it, I was like, there's no way that this guy could have done all this stuff.
Let's put it this way. When we first did this script, it took us about 4 takes to get through it.
We would break down laughing. It was just like, I don't know, can we say this, that the juvenile blood started coming out in us? We started thinking, you said that thing about high school, have mercy on your soul. Yeah, it's kind of like 2 high school kids here was what it was. We were laughing about this whole thing. But anyway, all this publicity finally got the attention of the American Medical Association, which started to keep its eye on the good doctor. Soon, Dr. Brinkley found a new and novel way to promote his gonad operations: radio. Now, how many of you have ever heard of the term? We used it, border blaster. Have you ever heard it before? Okay. Used to be, now this was, Steve and I talked about this because both of us in radio at one time. I can remember when I was young growing up, I would listen to a radio station in St. Louis. I would listen to KMOX radio. Sometimes I'd listen to the Cardinals. Sometimes I'd listen to the St. Louis Blues on hockey, but especially in the wintertime, it got so bad. You'd hear one thing of play-by-play coming across about the Blues, and then you'd hear someone chanting and screaming in Spanish, and it would be almost like it was next door, right to my house where I lived at. And this was one of those stations on the other end of the border that just pretty much at one time just cranked it up.
Yeah, what they did, and this comes a little bit later, he had a legitimate station in Kansas before this. There's a whole mess on that. But people would go down to the Mexican border. Say you're in Brownsville, you go across the border in Del Rio, and you would buy yourself a 1,000,000-watt radio station, put studios in Brownsville, and put people on and programming on from the American side, but you'd hear it all over the Southeast. Wolfman Jack was on a border blaster station out in, I think, Tijuana, if I'm not mistaken. But, yeah, that comes a little bit later, but he has some adventures in terms of the FCC, the Federal Trade Commission, and all that from his radio station in Kansas.
Well, he got enough money put together to start that radio station in Milford, Kansas, 1 kilowatt, KFKB, and the call letter stood for Kansas Folks Know Best. Then trouble came to the doctor again. You see, he tried to get a temporary license to do an operation in California, which was rejected by the state authorities, and then later on, the California Attorney General took on diploma mills, including the one that had been originally given Dr. Brinkley a license, and soon the California authorities, they were on his doorstep, knocking on the door, wanting to arrest him for applying for that medical license in that particular state. But by this time, Brinkley's fame bought him protection as the governor of Kansas refused to extradite him. Now, saying that Dr. Brinkley was making too much money for the state, he took his radio station to brag about how important it was and promoting his gonad treatment for hours on end. And this reminds me of Pappy O'Daniel from Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? I mean, it's just like the governor coming in there and says, you know, cool, clean water and Pappy O'Daniel flour is kind of what it reminds me of. Well, what ended up happening was the money he made for the radio station was plowed back into the town, and Brinkley paid for a new sewer system in the town and sidewalks and power lines. He sponsored the local baseball team, being a model citizen more than anything else. And they named the baseball team the Brinkley Goats in his honor. Okay, as we go on here. So around 1927, John and Minnie had a son, John Richard Brinkley III. They called him Johnny Boy by his name, at least what they called him. And the baby was brought onto the radio station that very day where listeners heard his voice along with his father's. Now, these treatments, along with recommended pharmaceuticals, eventually brought Dr. Brinkley, get this, over $10 million a year in profit. Now, that's back in the 20s. This is right prior to the Great Depression, too, right around the time of the Depression. $10 million a year. Now, that was profit. But soon, the fame and fortune brought unwelcome scrutiny out of the whole thing. The Kansas City Star, they owned a radio station that was in direct competition with KFKB. And it used to be radio stations, when they were in competition with each other, they'd find anything they could to go and try to pin on somebody and say, you shouldn't listen to this radio station. Well, they investigated the good doctor. I should have said good. He's not really that good of a doctor, was he?
We'll look it over this time.
We'll look over it, okay. So they started investigating him. They started running all these unfavorable articles in the Kansas City Star. And by 1930, the Kansas Medical Board held a hearing on the medical license, at which it was revealed, get this, 42 of his patients had died after their operation. Okay, so with those 42 that had died, here he was, and you know, all of this information coming out about him, wow. The board revoked his license. Well, 6 months later, the FCC, well, I should say the Federal Radio Commission, the forerunner of the FCC, refused to renew his license to operate KFKB, finding his broadcasts were mostly advertising, which violated the law and international treaties and was contrary to the public interest, convenience and necessity. So he took the case to court, but the courts upheld the revocation of his license. So you think he'd learned a lesson out of this. He would have been chastened, humbled by some chance. Well, you'd be wrong. So he immediately launched a campaign for governor of Kansas, so he could appoint his own members to the Kansas Medical Board and then get his medical license back. He campaigned with stars from his old radio station who would play country and western music at every campaign stop across the state. Now that's where we drop in who in this?
Well, the Carter family.
The Carter family. So if you remember, of course, the Carter family and the Bristol sessions, and it would have been short-lived. But then A.P. Carter kind of gets whiff of this, and then they start traveling across the country, and what happens?
Yeah.
They get on the radio station, and they're broadcast all over the place, okay? So as it goes on, he would go and enlist a pilot with his own plane, which Brinkley dubbed the Romancer, to deliver Brinkley in grand style at his campaign rallies. In short, Brinkley was a master of the publicity stunt when a prominent newspaper reporter ran an article critical of his qualifications to run for state. Brinkley, in turn, sent him a nice little gift. He sent him a goat. He lost to Harry Hines Woodring for the nomination, and then he planned to run again in 1932, but this time he needed a more powerful voice, and he found it in the town of Del Rio, Texas. And you see, Mexico was setting up their powerful radio stations near the American border at that time and licensing them to American businessmen to reach up into the middle of the country. So Dr. John Brinkley obtained a license from the Mexican government for a 50,000 watt station with the call letters XER just across the bridge from Del Rio and Villa Acuna. The FRC tried very desperately to shut down the radio station, but they were unsuccessful. In 1931, XER signed on at 840 kilohertz, with Brinkley dubbing it the Sunshine Station Between the Nations. He used this station to resume his campaign for governor in 1932, but he would sit in Milford and call his broadcasts by telephone. He ended up losing to a famous name, Alf Landon, who eventually, that was the governor of Kansas. I think also senator at one time. I think he was U.S. senator, wasn't he?
He ran for president.
Ran for president too, you're right. What he needed, though, was more power, okay? Mexico gave it to him. And eventually he was operating at 1 million watts. He could be heard in Canada, all over the United States. And it was said that if you were in Del Rio, the station's signal was so strong, it could turn on car headlights, make bed springs hum, and allow you to hear it through your dental fillings. Okay. In between his pitches for the campaigns and his campaigns, he kept giving medical advice and selling different potions and concoctions designed to help men gain sexual prowess, as if once wasn't, something for him to learn from. He also performed prostate operations in Del Rio and would sell airtime to any huckster or con man looking to advertise. So he also packed his XER radio station with other people, and including the Carter family, Gene Autry, okay, Red Foley. Anybody have ever heard of Red Foley before? Okay.
His father-in-law.
That's right. Jimmy Rogers, the singing brakeman, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
that's right.
And they were all happy to come to town to perform for all of North America. It's probably one of the biggest venues they could have had anywhere, because if they went to WSM in the Grand Ole Opry, it only got out to a moderate, area back in those days. But this covered the entire United States, into Canada too, and covered into Mexico too. I don't know how much they understood of the songs and everything back then in Mexico. Maybe some of them did. But
Hey, a good song is a good song,
well,
man.
good songs are good songs. At least it's something to tap your foot to. That's what matters. So XER made national stars of all these folks. And Brinkley split his time between Milford, Kansas, and Del Rio, Texas. And, during this time, he was broadcasting, like I said, over by telephone, and then Congress passed a law to make that illegal. to where he couldn't do that, which was dubbed the Brinkley Act. I always wondered where this came from until we got together and we put this script together and found out the Brinkley Act, and I was like, dawned on me at that point. And the United States kept up the pressure on Mexico. That pressure worked, and in 1934, the Mexican government ended up revoking Brinkley's license for XER. And Mexican soldiers arrived at the station to take control and turn the station off. So, in 1936, he'd amassed enough wealth to build a mansion for himself and his wife on 16 acres of land. He continued to do some of his practice in Texas, mostly doing vasectomies and prostate operations. That thrived for a time being, at least for a while. But during this time, he had a stable of at least a dozen Cadillacs, a greenhouse, a foaming fountain garden surrounded by 8,000 bushes, exotic animals imported from the Galapagos, I can't even say it right now. The Galapagos, what is it?
Galapagos?
Galapagos. I'm saying it with the Southwest Virginia accent here. And swimming pool with a 10-foot diving tower. And Brinkley continued living high off the hog in Del Rio. That should have been high off the goat, I should have said. Until in 1938, a rival doctor began cutting into Brinkley's business by offering similar procedures and doing it much cheaply. So, when Del Rio City's elders refused to put the competitor out of business, Brinkley closed up shop, reopened in downtown Little Rock, Arkansas, across from another hospital, what is now the Mary Lake Monastery. That poetic justice almost, in a way. His competition from Del Rio opened a new cancer center in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, about 150 miles northwest of Little Rock. So as it goes on, oh my gosh, we've just got so much more about him right here. Let me just kind of cut to it here a little bit more. In 1938, there was Morris Fishman, who was made a career exposing medical frauds. He published a 2-part series called Modern Medical Charlatans and included a thorough repudiation of Brinkley's career and exposed him to his questionable medical credentials. Brinkley then turned around and sued him for libel and $250,000 in damages, $4,250,000 in today's standards. The trial began on March 22, 1939, before a Texas judge, and a few days later, the jury found for Fishman, stating that Brinkley, quote, should be considered a charlatan and quack in the ordinary, well-understood meaning of those words. Now, the jury verdict unleashed a barrage of lawsuits against Brinkley, by some estimates well over $3 million in total. The IRS began to investigate him for tax fraud, and he finally declared bankruptcy in 1941. So soon after the post office the department began investigating him for mail fraud, Brinkley became a patient himself, having suffered 3 heart attacks and the amputation of one of his legs due to poor circulation. He might have needed that goat operation after all, mightn't he?
Well, it may have, yeah.
Makes me think about that for a minute. Anyway, on May 26, 1942, John Brinkley died penniless of heart failure in San Antonio, Texas. And the mail fraud case had not yet come to trial. He was later buried at Forest Hill Cemetery in Memphis, Tennessee. So that's pretty much the story of John Brinkley, and I'd never heard of it before. Never heard of it until we started researching, and Steve had put some of this together, and when I did, I was just laughing and cackling, and then I get to the point of 42 men died, and then I'm like, did they opt to do this on their own, or did their wives, put them up to it and say, hey, I want to have babies,
well, the whole
something
thing
like
about
that.
this, Rod, is that all these men were begging him to do this.
Yeah, that's it.
They were
begging.
lining up to do that, and they
Right.
knew that people were dying as a result of these surgeries.
See, I don't have his age, but he died in 1942, and he was born back, let me go back here at the beginning, 1885.
So he's 60,
Yeah, 60.
almost 60.
Almost, yeah, 60. So that's pretty much it on John Brinkley. We saved the worst for last, if you want to call it that, so.
So with that old saying, the older the buck, the stiffer the horn.
Why did you say that? And I had water in my mouth. I just about spewed when you said that. Gosh.
See where that came from?
It could have been, Steve and I talked before we got down here and we said, how are we going to, how am I going to explain this? We're talking about coat gonads, here and stuff. Steve said, I don't know. Says there's some young kids here and stuff, and you better be careful and everything else. And so at least when I saw the crowd come in, I thought, okay, everybody's adults. So we ought to be able to handle this. But then during the whole process, I'm talking about this, and I say goat gonads. I hear laughing from over in here somewhere. And this laughing keeps on at just different spots. And so I'm like, okay, I guess we've hit it at least. At least people are listening to it and know what we're talking about. So.
That very well could have been where that came from.
It could have been, actually, yeah.
I've heard that forever. What?
I've never heard that till now.
Only the buck that's different from the horn.
I'd never heard that till now.
Oh, I'd heard it.
Never heard that.
Yeah.
Well, you're older than me, though.
I'm old too, yeah. Well, folks, we appreciate you listening to us. Particularly Rod, he had the more interesting story, but we do appreciate it. And those of you who listen to the podcast, we appreciate that. If you would like to check us out and you haven't done so, you can find us at storiesofappalachia.com. And we put out a new story every single week, usually released on Friday evenings. As I said, we're on YouTube, where we do a video version of the podcast. And we also are on TikTok and Instagram, where we do little 1-minute short stories of different parts of history. And do y'all have any questions before we go?
Or have your own story.
Or have your own stories, yeah.
Yeah.
Stories
Well,
about
I would
Sam.
like to say one thing, if I may. So I'm doing a heritage festival here called Halloween, doing it in this community. And next year, we're announcing this year, for next year, we're doing a longest beard contest
Oh,
in honor of Sam.
Awesome.
Brinkley. That's one of the many features we're doing. So we're trying to keep it all local as possible.
Well, try not to have a goat competition, okay?
That'd be pretty bad.
Yeah, it would be. Oh. That's good.
yes, sir.
You know, I never, this may be a dumb question, but you mentioned that the beard kept growing until it hit the ground. Did he do anything to stop that? Or, I mean, in other words, did it stop by itself?
It's not clear, but I would assume that when it got down to a certain point, he had to trim it. Otherwise, it's gonna, like that guy with a 14-foot beard.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Or he'd trip up on it or something,
Yeah.
the way it was if you didn't put it in the sack.
Even when you have it in the pouch, yeah.
Any other stories? Now, I know some folks have got pictures, if you would like to share them with everybody.
Or how many? So go ahead.
I just wanted to mention that my great-grandmother, her grandmother, met Uncle Sam Brinkley when she was a little girl.
Awesome.
Very clearly remembered me when he actually stayed at their farm overnight when he was on his way to Johnson City.
Awesome.
He stayed in Unicoi County. And the silk carriers must have been for Sundays, because she very clearly remembered that he wore it in a feed sack.
Oh, okay.
During the week.
During the week. Well, yeah, I guess he wouldn't want to get that
So
silk
he
pouch
wore it
messed
in,
up.
always wore it in a feed sack. Then I've got some notes here that were put down by my grandmother Brinkley in 1967. I don't know who all can see this. This was from the Barnum and Bailey circus. And in this picture are the 7 Sutherland sisters that he traveled with. And they had the longest hair in the world
And they
at the
did,
time.
and they did do the promotion for the shampoo and hair.
Oh, the hair tonic stuff?
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow.
And she said, his show included card tricks, he sang songs, he recited poetry, and he was also a ventriloquist.
Yeah. Because we'd heard that story about him throwing his voice. I think we heard a little bit about it. He was known for, did you mention it, David, or something? About throwing his voice or something. So that would add to that, so.
And she closed with the fact that he was good friends on the circuit with Annie Oakley, Chief Sitting Bull, and also Bubba Louisville, of course.
He was my grandma's third uncle, great uncle, maybe fourth. You know who Frank Green is that had the store? Well, that was my grandma's brother. So this same family, they were related through Howell, and there's the old home places down on Mine Creek. Yeah, but my grandma's been dead for years, but I know that that's her uncle.
So you all have connections to history, both of you.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
My husband's her grandpa.
Same with you. Yeah, you've got a connection.
My father-in-law was talked about walking with him from down there to local schools. There was a train depot there, I think. And they would walk to Buladean, and he talked about him carrying an umbrella. And you could see where it said he never would get his shoes muddy.
I've heard
Very
that.
neat man.
I've heard about that, yeah. Very fastidious.
He would walk to my grandfather's from Shell Creek and go across the Coke Creek, but I always remember him saying that there was no dust,
No dirt, no nothing.
no nothing.
Wow.
So I wanted to just find out how many of you here tonight are related back to Sam Brinkley?
Wow.
So that means you're related to John Brinkley, too. Uh-huh.
First cousins are.
Uh-huh. I know how it works. Yeah. No, I think one of the things Steve and I did right before we came down here, we went up to the cemetery and we saw the headstone for Samuel and his wife up there.
Yeah, both him and Vista.
And so that was that was nice to see that and everything. But, the big thing I was telling David here a little bit earlier before everybody started coming in, I'm just surprised at the amount of the Hugheses that are in the cemetery up there at the Presbyterian Church. Because Hughes is my mother's maiden name. And I had no idea that there were Hugheses. I knew there had been Hugheses in North Carolina, but I did not know they were.
Shuts across through there.
Yeah, that's what David was saying about the gap and everything. And so, and I'm just amazed because I never knew there were that many, here at least, so.
Now, his wife, Misty Street, was she from this area?
Yes.
Yeah.
Snow Creek.
From Cub Creek?
Snow Creek.
Snow Creek, okay. I just saw I didn't know it, her name was Buena Vista.
Buena Vista, that's where I'd heard that from. I'd heard that before somewhere. So.
Now, I grew up hearing the story of his candidacies, and I knew that, I'd always heard that he ran for governor of Arkansas as a write-in candidate, and only lost because of the misspelled names. It might have been one of the Kansas elections.
Well, I know we mentioned, and we will do this, we talked about going up to the graveyard. If you want, or interested in doing that, we can here as we're wrapping things up. But anybody else got a comment or a question? Or maybe you want to know something else about their program? We were going to show a couple of the videos tonight, but we found out we didn't have our connector for our data projector, so I couldn't hook it up. But you can definitely see them on YouTube. All right, anything? Thank you all for coming. Yeah, thank you for coming. Come up, talk to us.